Welcome to Wisdom. Relax. Close your eyes. You can drift off. Let the story carry you to sleep.
The death of Severus Alexander in the year 235 AD marked the beginning of one of the most turbulent periods in all of Roman history. What followed was not merely a change of ruler, but the collapse of an entire system that had governed the Mediterranean world for more than 2 centuries. The empire that had known relative stability under the Severan dynasty now entered a half-century of chaos, invasion, and near-constant civil war. This was the crisis of the 3rd century, and it would test the very foundations of Roman power in ways that no previous challenge had done. For the next 50 years, emperors would rise and fall with dizzying speed, frontiers would crumble under relentless barbarian pressure, and the very survival of the Roman state would hang in the balance. It is a story of remarkable endurance amid catastrophe, of an empire that bent nearly to breaking, but somehow found the strength to carry on. The man who ushered in this age of turmoil was Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus, known to history as Maximinus Thrax, or Maximinus the Thracian. He was born around the year 173 AD in Thrace, along the empire's Danubian frontier, in lands that had long been considered the very edge of civilization. His origins were humble in the extreme, a fact that ancient sources never tired of emphasizing with a mixture of contempt and fascination. Unlike the senators and aristocrats who had dominated imperial politics for generations, Maximinus came from the very bottom of Roman society. Some sources suggest his father was a Goth and his mother from an Hellenic tribe, making him barely Roman at all in the eyes of the snobbish senatorial class who would later write the histories. He was a man of enormous physical size and legendary strength, qualities that served him well as he rose through the ranks of the army from common soldier to high command. Ancient writers spoke in wonder of his towering height, his massive frame, and his ability to perform feats of strength that seemed almost superhuman. They said he could break a horse's leg with a single blow of his fist, and that his thumbprint was so large it served him as a bracelet. Whether these stories were true or merely the exaggerations of hostile sources, they painted a picture of a man utterly unlike the refined emperors of earlier generations. Maximinus represented something new and deeply unsettling in Roman political life. The complete soldier, unburdened by senatorial refinement or administrative experience, who had clawed his way to supreme power through sheer military prowess and the loyalty of his troops. He had never held the traditional magistracies that marked a proper senatorial career. He had never studied rhetoric or philosophy in the schools of Athens or Rome. He knew nothing of the subtle art of managing the Senate, of balancing the interests of the great aristocratic families, of maintaining the delicate fiction that the emperor was merely the first citizen among equals. What he knew was war, how to lead men in battle, how to inspire loyalty through shared hardship, how to defeat the enemies of Rome along the frozen rivers of the northern frontier. When the mutinous troops on the Rhine murdered Severus Alexander and his mother Julia Mamaea in March of 235 AD, they turned immediately to Maximinus, their commanding general. The soldiers had grown frustrated with Alexander's cautious approach to warfare, his reliance on diplomacy and payment rather than the honest clash of arms, and the dominant influence of his mother over imperial policy. They wanted a fighter, a soldier's soldier, who would lead them to glory and plunder rather than negotiate with barbarians from a safe distance. In Maximinus they found exactly that. The legions proclaimed him emperor on the spot, without waiting for the Senate's approval or the blessing of any constitutional authority, making him what historians would later call the first of the barracks emperors. His accession marked the true beginning of the crisis of the 3rd century. Maximinus reigned from 235 to 238 AD, and during those 3 years he remained almost constantly with his armies on the frontier. He fought aggressive campaigns across the Rhine and Danube, battling Germanic and Sarmatian tribes with a ferocity that won him military titles and the grudging respect of his soldiers. The frontier wars were real and pressing, for the barbarian peoples beyond the rivers had grown bolder during the troubles of the Severan period. Constant vigilance was required to keep them at bay, and Maximinus threw himself into this work with tremendous energy, leading his troops personally in battle and sharing their hardships in camp. Yet he rarely engaged with the Senate or the traditional structures of Roman government. He never visited Rome during his entire reign, preferring the military camps of the frontier to the political intrigues of the capital. To his soldiers, this made him one of them. To the senators and Italian elites, it was proof that he was nothing more than a barbarian in purple robes. In the year 238 AD, the accumulated resentments against Maximinus exploded into open revolt. While besieging the city of Aquileia in northern Italy during a civil war sparked by rebellion and senatorial opposition, Maximinus met his end at the hands of his own men. The siege had dragged on longer than expected, supplies were running dangerously short, and the soldiers grew demoralized by the stubborn resistance of the city's defenders. Frustrated and hungry, facing the prospect of a long campaign with little glory and less plunder, they turned on the emperor who had led them into this desperate situation. Maximinus and his son were murdered by their own troops, who then cut off their heads and sent them to Rome as proof that the tyrant was finally dead. The Senate received this grisly trophy with undisguised relief and ordered the heads displayed on poles in the Forum. Marcus Antonius Gordianus, known as Gordian I, was born around 158 AD into the wealthy aristocratic class that Maximinus so conspicuously lacked. His family claimed descent from the famous Gracchi brothers, those noble reformers of the Roman Republic, and he had enjoyed a distinguished senatorial career that spanned many decades of service. He served as consul and eventually as proconsul of the province of Africa, governing from the great city of Carthage. He was an old man by the time of the revolt against Maximinus, perhaps 80 years of age, a literary gentleman who had written poetry in his younger days. He had no particular desire for the purple, no burning ambition to rule the world. But when local elites in Africa pressed him to accept the imperial title, offering it as the only alternative to destruction at the hands of Maximinus, he reluctantly agreed. Pressured by provincial aristocrats who had already committed treason by murdering imperial tax officials, Gordian and his son Gordian II accepted acclamation as emperors in early 238 AD. The Senate in Rome quickly endorsed their claim, declaring Maximinus a public enemy and aligning itself with the African revolt in a bold gamble for senatorial supremacy. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that the traditional ruling class might reassert its control over Roman politics. But Gordian I and his son held power for only about 3 weeks. When a loyalist commander from neighboring Mauritania defeated and killed Gordian II in battle, the elder Gordian hanged himself rather than face capture. Their tragic, swift fall illustrated how provincial revolts could make emperors overnight, but without military force to sustain them, those same emperors would fall just as quickly. It was a harsh lesson that Rome would learn again and again in the decades to come. The younger Gordian, Marcus Antonius Gordianus II, had been born around 192 AD. He shared power with his father during those desperate weeks of the African revolt, serving as co-emperor in a partnership born of crisis rather than careful planning. While his father remained in Carthage, attending to the administrative work of their fragile regime, Gordian II took to the field, attempting to defend their claim with whatever forces could be gathered from the province. He was in his mid-40s, younger and more energetic than his aged father, and he possessed the vigor that the situation demanded. But energy alone could not compensate for the absence of trained legions, and the provincial militia he commanded were no match for regular Roman soldiers. The battle that ended Gordian II's life was fought against a Mauritanian army loyal to Maximinus Thrax. The details are sparse in our surviving sources, but the outcome was devastating and decisive. The African levies broke before the disciplined assault of professional troops, their lines crumbling as trained soldiers cut through their ranks with practiced efficiency. Gordian fell somewhere in the chaos of that terrible defeat, perhaps leading a final desperate charge, perhaps cut down while trying to rally his fleeing men. His body may never have been recovered amid the carnage of the battlefield. The news of his death sealed his father's fate. The Senate, having committed itself irrevocably to the Gordian cause, now found itself without emperors and facing the approaching vengeance of Maximinus. In their desperation, they would turn to new candidates, new champions who might somehow salvage the situation. The co-reign of the two Gordians had lasted about 21 days, making it one of the shortest joint rules in Roman imperial history. Yet their brief rebellion would have lasting consequences, for it had shown that Maximinus could be opposed, that the Senate still possessed some capacity for independent action, and that the empire's control over its provinces was far more fragile than the mighty facade of Roman power might suggest. The death of the two Gordians in Africa left the Senate in a desperate position. They had openly declared Maximinus a public enemy, had thrown in their lot with the rebels, and now found themselves without an emperor to champion their cause. In their panic, they turned to two of their own number, elevating the elderly senators Pupienus and Balbinus as joint emperors to face the approaching threat. But the Roman people, ever suspicious of these aristocratic choices, demanded a Gordian. The name had become a rallying cry, a symbol of resistance to military tyranny, and the crowd would not be satisfied with unfamiliar senators. And so a boy was brought forward, the 13-year-old grandson of Gordian I, and he was made Caesar alongside the two new Augusti to appease the populace. When Pupienus and Balbinus were murdered by the Praetorian Guard just months later, their bodies dragged through the streets and left unburied, this child was left as sole emperor. He was Gordian III, and his improbable reign would prove far more consequential than anyone might have expected. Marcus Antonius Gordianus, the third emperor of that name, was born in the year 225 AD. He was a grandson of Gordian I through his daughter, and thus carried the family's claim to legitimacy, even if he was far too young to exercise any real power himself. When the Praetorian Guard murdered Pupienus and Balbinus in their camp in mid-238 AD, they proclaimed this young boy as sole emperor. The soldiers and the Senate accepted their choice, for there seemed no better alternative in a year that had already seen 6 emperors, and so Rome found itself ruled by a child. Gordian III became the youngest sole ruler in Roman history, ascending to supreme power at an age when most boys were still learning their letters, memorizing passages of Virgil, and being trained in the rhetorical arts that proper Romans considered essential. Gordian III reigned from 238 to 244 AD, and during those 6 years he grew from a boy into a young man under the guidance of powerful advisors. Chief among these was his father-in-law Timesitheus, a capable administrator and military commander who served as Praetorian prefect and effectively ran the empire in the young emperor's name. Timesitheus was everything an emperor needed in a chief minister: competent, loyal, and willing to do the hard work of government while his son-in-law learned the craft of ruling. He brought order to a government that had been badly shaken by the chaos of 238, reorganizing the administration, stabilizing the frontiers, and preparing for the great military enterprise that would dominate the latter part of Gordian's reign. When the Sasanian Persians, under their aggressive king, Shapur I, began threatening Rome's eastern provinces, Timesitheus marshaled the empire's resources for war. The Persians were no barbarian rabble to be scattered with a single campaign. They were the heirs of the ancient Persian Empire, a sophisticated civilization with a powerful professional army, skilled cavalry, and a king who dreamed of restoring the glory of Darius and Xerxes. They had already humiliated Rome once in living memory, and they seemed poised to do so again. But Timesitheus was confident, and the young emperor was eager for the glory that military victory would bring. The Persian campaign began with considerable success that exceeded even the most optimistic hopes. Roman armies crossed into Mesopotamia and won a series of victories that drove back the Sasanian forces and recaptured several important cities that had fallen to Persian arms. It seemed that the young emperor, guided by his skilled father-in-law, might achieve the glory that had eluded so many of his predecessors. The soldiers adored their boy emperor, who rode among them and shared their hardships even if real decisions remained in the hands of Timesitheus. But fate intervened with cruel swiftness, as it so often did during this troubled century. Timesitheus died during the campaign, probably from illness though poison was whispered, and without his guiding hand the expedition began to falter. A new Praetorian prefect emerged to fill the vacuum of power, a man named Philip who came from the distant province of Arabia. And Philip, it seems, had ambitions of his own that extended far beyond serving a teenage emperor. Gordian III died near the frontier in 244 AD, during the Persian campaign that had begun so promisingly. The circumstances of his death remain uncertain, shrouded in the propaganda of his successor and the conflicting accounts of ancient historians. Some ancient sources say he fell in battle, struck down by Persian arms while leading his troops in some skirmish or engagement that has been lost to history. Others claim he was killed in a plot orchestrated by Philip, who then blamed the Persians to deflect suspicion from his own treacherous hands. Still others suggest he died of wounds received in combat, and that Philip merely took advantage of the situation to seize power. Whatever the truth, Gordian III was dead at perhaps 19 years of age, his reign cut short before he could truly emerge from the shadow of his advisors and become a ruler in his own right. His body was buried far from Rome, in a tomb near the site of his death, a tomb whose location would eventually be forgotten as the centuries passed and the empire that he had briefly ruled transformed into something his contemporaries would not have recognized. The empire that had been entrusted to a child now passed to the man who may well have murdered him. Marcus Julius Philippus, known to history as Philip the Arab, was born around 204 AD in the province of Arabia, near the city of Shaba in modern Syria. His origins were provincial and relatively humble, far removed from the great aristocratic families of Rome and Italy who had once monopolized imperial power. He had risen through military service, making his way from the dusty camps and garrison towns of the eastern frontier to the heights of power in the Praetorian Guard. He was pragmatic, ambitious, and utterly ruthless when circumstances required such ruthlessness. When Gordian III died, Philip was perfectly positioned to seize control, and he wasted no time in doing exactly that, moving with the swift decisiveness of a man who understood that hesitation meant death. During the Persian War, Philip had become Praetorian prefect after the death of Timesitheus, placing him in command of the young emperor's personal guard and giving him effective control over the army. After Gordian's death in 244 AD, he negotiated a peace with the Persians that involved paying substantial sums to Shapur, a settlement that got the Roman army out of a dangerous situation, but that critics would later condemn as humiliating. With the Eastern crisis resolved, at least temporarily, Philip was proclaimed emperor by the troops, and the Senate in Rome had little choice but to accept their decision. Another provincial soldier had claimed the purple. Another outsider had muscled his way to the throne. Philip reigned from 244 to 249 AD, a span of 5 years that saw both celebration and catastrophe. The most memorable event of his reign was the celebration of Rome's millennium in 248 AD, when the city marked 1,000 years since its legendary founding by Romulus. Games and spectacles of unprecedented scale entertained the populace, exotic animals were slaughtered in the arena, and the empire briefly turned from its troubles to celebrate its glorious past. For a moment, it was possible to believe that Rome remained eternal, that the difficulties of recent decades were merely temporary setbacks in an otherwise inevitable march toward greatness. Philip presided over these celebrations with all the pomp that imperial resources could provide, minting coins that proclaimed the eternal city and sponsoring festivities that lasted for days. Yet even as Rome celebrated its past, the present was crumbling around the foundations of the state. Philip faced major crises throughout his reign, including frontier pressures that never seemed to relent and internal unrest that constantly threatened to spark into open revolt. The Danubian frontier was particularly troubled, with Gothic and other barbarian groups raiding deep into Roman territory, burning villages, carrying off captives, and defeating the forces sent to stop them. The empire's military resources were stretched thin, trying to defend too many miles of frontier with too few soldiers, and the emperor in Rome could not be everywhere at once. Local commanders were left to fend for themselves, and some began to wonder whether they might not do better as emperors themselves. When Danubian troops, frustrated by their defeats and the distant emperor's apparent neglect, rallied behind a general named Decius, Philip's reign entered its final crisis. Decius was an experienced military man from Pannonia, a region that had produced many soldiers and several emperors. He may not have sought the purple initially, but once his troops proclaimed him, he had little choice but to fight or die. In 249 AD, Philip marched north to confront this new usurper, gathering what forces he could for the decisive confrontation. The two armies met somewhere in the Balkans, possibly near Verona, and the battle that followed sealed Philip's fate. He was defeated and killed, along with his young son Philip II, whom he had made co-emperor in hopes of founding a dynasty. The man who had celebrated Rome's millennium would not live to see its 1001st year. His body was left on the battlefield, another emperor fallen in civil war, another reign ended by Roman swords rather than barbarian ones. The emperor who emerged from Philip's defeat was Gaius Messius Quintus Decius, a man whose brief reign would leave a lasting mark on both Roman and Christian history. Decius was born around 190 AD in Pannonia, along the Danubian frontier that had produced so many soldiers and so many emperors during this troubled century. He came from a provincial senatorial family, respectable enough, but not among the great houses of Rome that had once dominated imperial politics. He had built his career through military service and administrative competence, earning the trust of successive emperors and eventually of Philip himself. Philip sent him to the Danube to restore order among the rebellious legions there, to bring discipline to troops who had grown restless and discontented. It was a fateful choice, for Decius proved too successful at his task. The soldiers he had been sent to discipline instead acclaimed him as emperor, and Decius found himself facing a stark choice between seizing power or facing execution for the treason that his soldiers had committed in his name. In 249 AD, when Philip's troops proclaimed Decius emperor, he may not have sought the purple himself. Ancient sources suggest he tried at first to negotiate, to find some way out of the impossible situation in which he found himself, to convince the soldiers to rescind their dangerous acclamation. But his soldiers would not hear of it. They had chosen their emperor, raised him on their shields in the time-honored fashion, and they expected him to lead them to Rome or die trying. Decius marched south with the Danubian legions at his back, met Philip in battle somewhere in the northern provinces, and won a decisive victory that left his rival dead on the field. The Senate, informed of the outcome, had no choice but to accept this latest military coup, another emperor imposed upon them by the swords of provincial legions. It was becoming a familiar pattern, one that would repeat itself again and again as the crisis deepened. Decius reigned from 249 to 251 AD, and during those brief years he attempted something that no emperor had tried on such a scale before. He launched a systematic, empire-wide persecution of Christians, issuing edicts that required all inhabitants of the Roman world to perform public sacrifice to the traditional gods. This was not simply religious intolerance, though it certainly manifested as such. Decius saw the Christians as a threat to the unity and stability of the empire at a moment when unity and stability seemed to be crumbling on every side. By demanding universal participation in traditional religious rites, he hoped to bind the empire together through shared ritual, to restore the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods, that he believed had been disrupted by Christian refusal to sacrifice. The persecution was thorough and brutal in its systematic nature. Throughout the empire, officials set up commissions to oversee the sacrifices, and those who performed them received certificates proving their compliance with the imperial mandate. These certificates, some of which have survived to be discovered by archaeologists, bear witness to the bureaucratic efficiency with which the persecution was implemented. Those who refused faced imprisonment, torture, confiscation of property, and death. Many Christians complied under pressure, offering the required sacrifice or bribing officials for certificates without actually performing the rites. Others stood firm in their faith and suffered accordingly, enduring whatever punishments their persecutors devised. Bishops were targeted with particular ferocity, for they were the leaders who might stiffen resistance among their flocks and organize defiance of imperial commands. The persecution created a crisis within the Christian Church itself, as communities wrestled with what to do about those who had lapsed under pressure and later sought readmission to fellowship. It was a wound that would take years to heal and would spark bitter controversies about forgiveness and discipline that divided Christians for generations. Yet Decius did not live to see the full consequences of his religious policy, nor would he have the chance to consolidate his vision of a restored Roman unity. His reign was dominated by military crisis as much as by religious persecution. The Goths, a Germanic people who had been pressing against the empire's Danubian frontier for decades with increasing boldness, launched a massive invasion that swept across the Balkans, burning and pillaging as they went. Their armies were vast, their warriors fierce, and their leaders had learned much from their previous encounters with Roman forces. Decius gathered his forces and marched to meet them, determined to drive the barbarians back across the river and restore security to the ravaged provinces. The campaign went badly from the start, plagued by poor intelligence and difficult terrain. Roman forces suffered repeated setbacks, and the emperor himself fell in battle. The Battle of Abritus in 251 AD was one of the worst disasters in Roman military history. Decius and his son Herennius led their army against the Gothic forces in swampy terrain where the barbarians had prepared an ambush. The Romans were caught in difficult ground, unable to maneuver effectively, and the Goths fell upon them with devastating effect. Herennius was killed early in the fighting, struck down by an arrow. When word reached Decius of his son's death, he reportedly said that the loss of one soldier meant nothing to the state, and he pressed the attack with renewed fury. But the battle was already lost. The Roman army was destroyed, and Decius himself fell somewhere in the chaos, his body never recovered from the swampy battlefield. He was the first Roman emperor to die in battle against a foreign enemy, a grim milestone that illustrated just how desperate the empire's situation had become. The defeat at Abritus opened the floodgates to disaster. With the Roman army shattered and the emperor dead, the Goths and other barbarian peoples poured across the frontier almost at will, encountering little effective resistance. The provinces of the Balkans suffered devastation on a scale they had not seen in centuries. Cities that had grown wealthy and complacent under the long Roman peace were sacked and burned. Populations were enslaved by the thousands, marched off in chains to serve their new Gothic masters. Whole regions were depopulated as the survivors fled to safer lands, abandoning farms and villages to the flames. The new emperor, Trebonianus Gallus, who had somehow survived Abritus and been acclaimed by what remained of the battered army, could do little but pay tribute to the Goths and hope they would take their plunder and go away. It was a stopgap measure at best, an admission of weakness that satisfied no one and only encouraged further aggression. Publius Licinius Valerianus, known as Valerian, emerged from this chaos as the next in the long line of crisis emperors. He was born in the early 3rd century into a prominent senatorial family, one of the few among the barracks emperors who could claim genuine aristocratic pedigree. His ancestors had held consulships and governorships, had sat in the front rows of the Senate, and advised earlier emperors on matters of state. Valerian himself had held high offices under previous emperors and had earned a reputation for competence and reliability in an age when both qualities were in desperately short supply. When the brief reign of Trebonianus Gallus collapsed amid renewed Gothic raids and military revolt in 253 AD, Valerian's troops proclaimed him emperor. Unlike so many of his predecessors, he had the experience and the connections to stabilize the situation, at least temporarily. Valerian reigned from 253 to 260 AD, and he immediately recognized that the empire's problems were too great for one man to handle alone, no matter how capable or experienced. He made his son Gallienus co-emperor, dividing the burden of defense between them in a formal partnership. Valerian took responsibility for the East, where the Sasanian Persians under Shapur posed an existential threat to Rome's wealthy eastern provinces with their great cities, their lucrative trade routes, and their populations of taxpayers on whom the empire depended. Gallienus remained in the west, struggling against the Germanic peoples who pressed relentlessly against the Rhine and Danube frontiers, probing for weakness, seeking plunder, testing the strength of Roman defenses. It was a practical arrangement born of desperation, an acknowledgement that the empire was simply too large and its enemies too numerous for a single ruler to manage effectively. The challenges Valerian faced in the East were immense, perhaps unprecedented in their combination and severity. The Persians had been raiding Roman territory for years, and Shapur dreamed of nothing less than the conquest of Rome's entire Eastern Empire, the recovery of all the lands that had once belonged to the ancient Persian kings before Alexander the Great had destroyed their dynasty. Gothic pirates ravaged the coasts of Asia Minor, attacking wealthy cities that had known peace for generations and whose walls had fallen into disrepair. Plague swept through the empire, killing soldiers and civilians alike and disrupting the administrative and economic systems on which Roman power depended. The so-called Plague of Cyprian was devastating entire regions, depopulating cities, and leaving the living too few to bury the dead. Valerian gathered what forces he could from depleted garrisons and exhausted provinces, and he marched east to confront these multiplying disasters, determined to restore Roman prestige and drive back the Persian advance before the East was lost forever. The campaign against the Persians brought Valerian to the greatest humiliation any Roman emperor had ever suffered. While operating near the city of Edessa in 260 AD, attempting to negotiate or perhaps to fight his way out of a deteriorating military situation, Valerian was captured alive by the Persian king Shapur I. The exact circumstances remain disputed by ancient sources, with Roman writers blaming treachery and claiming that Shapur had lured the elderly emperor to a peace conference only to seize him, while Persian accounts boasted of military victory on the battlefield. The relief carvings that Shapur commissioned at Nakshi Rostam show the Persian king on horseback, triumphantly grasping the arm of a kneeling Roman emperor in a scene of utter humiliation. What is certain is that a Roman emperor, the commander of Rome's eastern armies, the holder of imperium and the sacred dignity of the purple, fell into the hands of his enemy and never returned to his homeland. Valerian died in Persian captivity at some unknown date, his fate a subject of grisly legend. Later stories claimed that Shapur used him as a human mounting block when getting onto his horse, forcing the aged Roman to kneel so the Persian king could step on his back. Some accounts say that after his death his skin was stuffed with straw and displayed as a trophy in a Persian temple, a permanent reminder of Persian triumph over Roman power. Whether these tales are true or merely Roman horror stories born of shame and impotent rage, they captured the shock that this unprecedented disaster inspired throughout the Roman world. Valerian's capture left his son Gallienus as sole emperor, but it also left the empire more fragmented and vulnerable than ever before. The very fabric of Roman unity began to unravel in the wake of the catastrophe at Edessa. In the west, a general named Postumus seized power in Gaul and established what historians call the Gallic Empire, a breakaway state that would control Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain for over a decade while claiming to represent true Roman authority. In the east, the city of Palmyra under its dynamic leader Odenathus, and later his widow Zenobia, assumed effective control over Rome's eastern provinces, defending them against Persian aggression, but also asserting an independence that Rome could not effectively challenge. The empire that Gallienus inherited was an empire in pieces, with rivals and rebels on every side and barbarian invaders penetrating ever deeper into provinces that had once seemed secure. Publius Licinius Ignatius Gallienus, who had already served as co-emperor with his father since 253 AD, now found himself sole ruler of what remained of Central Roman authority. He was born around 218 AD, well-educated and cultured in a way that set him apart from many of the rough soldier emperors of this period. He patronized philosophers and artists, and he seems to have genuinely appreciated Greek culture and learning in ways that his military rivals dismissed as a feat. But he was also a capable commander who understood that the empire's survival depended on military reform as much as on military victories. Gallienus ruled from 253 to 268 AD, with sole power from 260 after his father's capture. And during this period he implemented significant changes in how Rome organized its defenses. Recognizing that the old system of static frontier garrisons was inadequate to meet the multiple simultaneous threats the empire faced, he developed a more mobile cavalry reserve that could be shifted rapidly from one crisis point to another. This mobile field army, stationed at strategic points in the interior rather than spread thin along the borders, represented a new approach to imperial defense that would be developed further by later emperors. He also increasingly excluded senators from military commands, relying instead on professional officers of equestrian rank who had risen through the ranks. This was practical but deeply offensive to the senatorial aristocracy, who saw their traditional privileges being stripped away. The challenges Gallienus faced were staggering in their scope and simultaneity. He fought repeatedly against Goths, Alemanni, and other Germanic groups who poured across the frontiers into the Balkans and Italy itself. On multiple occasions, barbarian raiders reached Italian soil, something that had scarcely happened since the darkest days of the Republic. He struggled to maintain control over provinces that were slipping away to the Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene sphere in the east. Though he chose to focus on defending the Italian heartland rather than attempting to reconquer regions he lacked the resources to hold. He faced usurper after usurper, men who saw in the empire's weakness an opportunity for their own advancement, and he defeated most of them through a combination of military skill and political cunning. In 268 AD, Gallienus was assassinated during the siege of a usurper named Aurelius near Milan. The conspiracy involved senior officers in his own army, men who had grown tired of his long reign or who had their own ambitions for the purple. They killed him and immediately proclaimed one of their number as emperor. Gallienus died having held the empire together, barely, through some of its darkest hours. Later writers, particularly those sympathetic to the Senate he had marginalized, painted him as a frivolous and incompetent ruler who fiddled while Rome burned. Modern historians have been kinder, recognizing that he faced impossible odds and managed to prevent complete collapse through a combination of military reform and strategic pragmatism. The man who emerged from Gallienus's assassination was Marcus Aurelius Claudius, known to history as Claudius Gothicus for the great victory that defined his brief reign. He was born around 214 AD in the Balkans, probably in the region of Dardania in what is now Serbia, another product of the frontier provinces that had supplied so many of the empire's soldiers and emperors during this troubled century. He had risen through the ranks of the army, distinguishing himself as a capable commander under Gallienus, and he was among those who plotted his predecessor's death. Whether he was the instigator of the conspiracy or merely a beneficiary remains unclear, but when Gallienus fell, Claudius was ready to assume the purple. Claudius Gothicus reigned from 268 to 270 AD, a mere 2 years that nonetheless marked a crucial turning point in the crisis of the 3rd century. His greatest achievement came almost immediately when he faced and defeated a massive Gothic invasion at the Battle of Nisus in 269 AD. The Goths had crossed the Danube in enormous numbers, perhaps the largest invasion force they had yet assembled, combining multiple tribes and clans into a single terrifying host. They threatened to overwhelm the battered Roman defenses entirely, to sweep through the Balkans and into the heart of the empire. Claudius gathered what forces he could and met them near the city of Nisus, his own hometown in the rugged terrain of the Balkans, and there he won a decisive victory that shattered Gothic power for a generation. The Battle of Nisus was a masterpiece of tactical skill and desperate courage. Claudius used the terrain to his advantage, luring the Gothic host into unfavorable ground where their numbers could not be brought to bear effectively. The Roman infantry held firm against the initial barbarian onslaught, their discipline and training showing their worth against the fierce but disorganized Gothic charges. When the moment was right, Roman cavalry struck the Gothic flanks, and the barbarian army dissolved into a rout. Tens of thousands of Goths fell in the battle and the pursuit that followed, their bodies littering the roads and fields for miles around Nisus. Many more were captured and either enslaved or settled as farmers on depopulated Roman lands. Rome could finally claim a major victory after years of humiliating defeats, and Claudius earned his surname Gothicus for this triumph. The victory at Nisus helped stabilize the Danube frontier and restored some measure of Roman prestige after the disasters of the preceding decades. Claudius followed up his success with campaigns against the Alemanni and other Germanic groups, working methodically to rebuild Roman military power and push back the tide of invasion. He also began the slow process of reintegrating the breakaway states, though he did not live long enough to complete this work. The Gallic and Palmyrene empires still stood apart, but the momentum had shifted. Rome was recovering slowly and painfully from the nadir of the crisis. Claudius Gothicus died in 270 AD, not in battle against the barbarians he had so recently defeated, but from the plague that had ravaged the empire for decades. The plague of Cyprian, as later generations would call it, had stalked the empire since at least the 250s, killing millions and depopulating whole regions. It took rich and poor alike, soldiers and civilians, emperors and slaves. Claudius, who had survived the dangers of battle, could not survive the invisible enemy that lurked in every camp and city. His death was a blow to Roman hopes, cutting short a reign that had begun so promisingly. But it was a natural death rather than another assassination, and it allowed for a relatively orderly succession to the next emperor. His brief reign had shown that the empire could still produce capable leaders, that Roman armies could still win decisive victories against seemingly overwhelming odds, and that the crisis, however terrible, was not necessarily terminal. The work of restoration would continue under his successors, who would build on the foundations he had laid in the blood-soaked fields around Nisus. The death of Claudius Gothicus brought to power one of the most remarkable men of the entire Roman imperial period, a soldier emperor who would earn the title Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. Lucius Domitius Aurelianus, known simply as Aurelian, was born around 214 AD in the Balkans, probably in the region of Dacia Ripensis or Moesia, another son of the frontier provinces that had supplied so many of Rome's 3rd-century emperors. His origins were humble indeed, the son of a peasant farmer or perhaps a tenant on senatorial estates, a man with no family connections or inherited wealth to smooth his path to power. He had risen to prominence through military service alone, through courage in battle and skill in command. He was tough, disciplined, and utterly ruthless when circumstances demanded ruthlessness. But he was also a gifted strategist who could see beyond the immediate crisis to the larger work of imperial restoration that the desperate times required. He was, in short, exactly what the empire needed. Aurelian became emperor in 270 AD after a brief interlude when Claudius's brother Quintillus claimed the throne. The Danubian legions, who had their own candidate in mind, proclaimed Aurelian instead, and Quintillus was either killed by his own soldiers or took his own life rather than face the inevitable defeat at the hands of a better general with more loyal troops. The new emperor wasted no time in asserting his authority and addressing the multiple crises that still threatened to tear the empire apart. Unlike some of his predecessors who had been content merely to survive, merely to hold what remained of Roman territory against the endless pressure of enemies foreign and domestic, Aurelian was determined to restore Rome to its former glory, to reunify the fragmented state and secure its borders against the barbarian tide that had threatened to engulf civilization itself. Aurelian reigned from 270 to 275 AD, a mere 5 years that accomplished more than many longer reigns. His most famous achievement was the reunification of the empire, the crushing of the breakaway states that had emerged during the dark years of the 260s when it seemed that Roman unity was a thing of the past. He turned first to the east, where the Palmyrene Empire under Queen Zenobia had grown from a useful buffer state into a direct challenge to Roman authority. Zenobia was one of the most remarkable women of antiquity, intelligent, ambitious, and daring. She had claimed the purple for her young son Vabalithus, had minted her own coins bearing imperial titles, and had extended her control over Egypt and much of Rome's eastern territories, creating a new empire within the shell of the old. Aurelian marched east with his battle-hardened legions, fought and defeated the Palmyrene forces in a series of bloody engagements, besieged and captured the great caravan city of Palmyra itself, and took Zenobia prisoner. The famous queen was taken back to Rome to grace his triumphal procession, walking in golden chains before the Roman crowds, and Palmyra's challenge was ended forever. With the east secured by the defeat of Palmyra, Aurelian turned his attention to the west, where the Gallic Empire still maintained its stubborn independence under a succession of rulers. The Gallic Empire had begun as a desperate response to the crisis of the 260s, an attempt to provide local defense when the central government seemed unable to do so. But by Aurelian's time it had become simply another rival claiming imperial legitimacy. Aurelian defeated the last Gallic emperor, Tetricus, in battle at the Catalonian fields in 274 AD, though some sources suggest that Tetricus, weary of his responsibilities and the constant threats he faced from both barbarians and his own restless soldiers, may have essentially defected to the Roman side before the battle was decided. Either way, the result was the same, and Tetricus marched in Aurelian's triumph alongside Zenobia. For the first time in over a decade, the Mediterranean world was again united under a single Roman emperor, and Aurelian could claim to have truly restored the world. Aurelian also strengthened the defenses of Rome itself, recognizing that the city's old walls were no longer adequate to protect the capital in an age when barbarian raids could penetrate deep into Italy. He began construction of the massive Aurelian walls, a circuit of brick-faced concrete fortifications nearly 12 miles in circumference that enclosed a much larger area than the ancient Servian walls, and that would protect Rome for centuries to come. These walls, many sections of which still stand today as monuments to his foresight, are testimony to the new reality that even Rome itself was no longer safe from attack. The Eternal City needed walls for the first time in centuries, and Aurelian provided them. He also reformed the coinage, attempting to address the economic chaos that decades of debasement and inflation had caused, stabilizing the currency and restoring some measure of confidence in Roman money. His was a reign of restoration in every sense of the word, touching military affairs, territorial integrity, urban defense, and economic stability. Yet Aurelian did not live to enjoy the fruits of his labors or to complete all the work he had begun. In 275 AD, while preparing for another campaign against the Persians who had humiliated Valerian years before, he was assassinated by officers of his own army. The conspiracy apparently arose from a misunderstanding, or perhaps from forged documents created by a corrupt secretary who feared punishment for his crimes. These forgeries convinced certain officers that the emperor planned to have them executed, and they struck first, killing Aurelian before he could defend himself or explain the truth. It was a tragic end for a man who had done so much to save the empire, struck down not by barbarian swords or Persian arrows, but by the treachery of his own men acting on false information. The restorer of the world died far from Rome, his great work incomplete, but his legacy secure in the reunified empire and the mighty walls that bore his name. The period following Aurelian's death saw several short-lived emperors before the rise of another capable ruler. Marcus Aurelius Probus came to power in 276 AD, following the brief reigns of Tacitus and Florian. Probus was born around 232 AD in Sirmium, the great military center in the Balkans that had produced so many emperors during this troubled era. Like Aurelian and Claudius before him, he was a professional soldier who had risen through the ranks by merit and courage, earning distinction in campaigns along the empire's troubled frontiers where every year brought new challenges and new dangers. He was acclaimed emperor by the Eastern legions following Florian's death, and his capabilities quickly proved themselves equal to the enormous tasks that awaited him. Probus reigned from 276 to 282 AD, 6 years during which he continued the work of restoration that Aurelian had begun so magnificently. He fought a series of successful campaigns against Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube, driving back invaders who had once again begun to test Roman defenses in the aftermath of Aurelian's death. His victories were thorough and decisive, and he earned a reputation as one of the most capable military emperors of the century. He resettled many defeated barbarians as farmers on depopulated Roman lands, hoping to restore agricultural productivity while providing a buffer of semi-Romanized peoples along the frontiers. He repaired the damage that decades of war had inflicted on provincial cities and infrastructure, working systematically to rebuild what the crisis had destroyed and to restore the prosperity that peace could bring. But Probus was a demanding master who expected the same discipline from his soldiers in peace that he demanded in war. He insisted on hard work from his soldiers even in times of peace, setting them to tasks like draining marshes, constructing roads, and building public works when there were no enemies to fight. This was sensible policy from the perspective of keeping idle soldiers out of trouble and improving the empire's infrastructure, work that needed to be done if the provinces were to recover. But it was deeply unpopular with men who felt that soldiers should fight, not dig ditches like common laborers. In 282 AD, his troops mutinied during one of these construction projects, reportedly while draining marshes near Sirmium, his own hometown. They killed him before he could escape or summon loyal forces, ending the reign of another effective emperor before his work was done. Like so many before him, Probus fell not to foreign enemies, but to the violence of his own men. Marcus Aurelius Carus, who emerged as emperor after Probus's murder, was a senior officer who had served under his predecessor and who may have been complicit in the conspiracy that killed him, or who at least was willing to profit from it. He was born sometime in the early 3rd century, probably in Gaul or perhaps in Illyria, and he had extensive military experience gained over decades of service. The Danubian legions proclaimed him emperor immediately after Probus fell, and he moved quickly to consolidate his position before any rivals could emerge. He made his sons Carinus and Numerian co-rulers, attempting to establish a dynasty that might bring stability to the endless cycle of usurpation and assassination that had plagued Rome for 50 years. Carinus was left to govern the west while Carus and Numerian marched east against Rome's perpetual enemy, the Sasanian Persians who had so humiliated Valerian decades before and who still threatened Rome's wealthy eastern provinces. Carus reigned from 282 to 283 AD, leading his eastern campaign with the same energy and determination that had characterized the best of the soldier emperors who preceded him. The Persian War went remarkably well at first, exceeding the most optimistic hopes. Roman forces advanced deep into Mesopotamia, meeting little effective resistance from a Persian empire that was itself distracted by internal troubles and succession disputes. The great rivers that had so often marked the limits of Roman expansion now flowed behind the advancing legions, their waters no longer barriers, but highways for supply and communication. In a stunning reversal of the humiliation suffered under Valerian 2 decades before, Carus reportedly captured the great Persian capital of Ctesiphon, that storied city on the Tigris that had seen so many armies pass beneath its walls over the centuries. It was an achievement that had eluded Roman commanders for generations, a triumph that seemed to herald a new era of Roman ascendancy in the East. Veteran soldiers who remembered the shame of Valerian's capture could now hold their heads high again, knowing that Rome had avenged her honor in the only way that mattered. It seemed that Rome's eastern frontier might finally be secure, that the Persian threat which had overshadowed so many reigns might at last be definitively contained. But Carus did not live to savor his triumph or to consolidate his conquests. In late 283 AD, while still campaigning in the east, he died under mysterious circumstances that later sources attributed to a lightning strike. Whether he was actually killed by a bolt from the heavens, a fitting end for a man who had dared to reach so high, or whether this was merely a convenient explanation for assassination or sudden illness, we cannot know with certainty. Ancient writers loved the symbolism of the lightning strike, the gods themselves intervening to end a reign that had perhaps grown too ambitious. What is certain is that his death threw the succession into chaos once again. His son Numerian, who had accompanied him on the campaign, assumed power in the east, while Carinus continued to rule in the west from the comfortable distance of the Italian provinces. The dynasty that Carus had hoped to establish seemed briefly to have taken hold. Numerian's reign was even stranger and shorter than his father's. After Carus's death, the army began the long march home from Persia, but Numerian fell ill with an eye infection and withdrew into a closed litter, supposedly to protect his inflamed eyes from the harsh eastern sun that beat down mercilessly on the dusty roads. Days passed, then weeks, with no one seeing the emperor. Officials brought documents to the litter for his seal, received them back with the imperial mark, and assumed all was well. The strange silence from within was attributed to the emperor's illness, his need for darkness and rest. Eventually, the smell of death emanating from the litter revealed the terrible truth that those closest to power had been concealing. Numerian had been dead for some time, murdered by his own father-in-law, the Praetorian prefect Arrius Aper. The army, discovering this grim secret hidden beneath silken curtains, demanded justice and a new emperor to lead them home. The man who emerged from this crisis would fundamentally reshape the Roman world. Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus, known to history as Diocletian, was a soldier from Dalmatia who had risen through the ranks to high command. When the troops assembled to choose a new emperor, they acclaimed Diocletian, and his first act was to personally execute Aper with his own sword before the assembled army, avenging Numerian and establishing his authority with a single dramatic stroke. He then faced down Carinus in civil war, winning a battle in which Carinus was conveniently murdered by his own officers before victory was complete. By 285 AD, Diocletian stood as sole ruler of the Roman Empire, the latest in a long line of soldier emperors, but one who would prove fundamentally different from those who came before. The half-century that stretched from 235 to 284 AD, this period we call the crisis of the 3rd century, had transformed the Roman world in ways that contemporaries could scarcely comprehend. Most emperors during this period had seized power through military acclamation rather than through established succession. The old senatorial aristocracy, which had once provided emperors and shaped imperial policy, had been marginalized in favor of professional officers who rose from the ranks. Frontiers that had seemed secure for generations had been breached again and again, with barbarian raiders penetrating deep into the heart of the empire. Provinces had broken away entirely, forming their own states with their own emperors. Plague had swept through the population, killing millions and disrupting every aspect of social and economic life. The economy had collapsed, with inflation rendering the currency nearly worthless and trade networks breaking down. Yet the empire had survived. Somehow, despite everything, the Roman state had endured when it might easily have perished. Emperors like Claudius Gothicus, Aurelian, and Probus had shown that capable leadership could still make a difference, that Roman armies could still win victories, that lost provinces could still be recovered. The empire that emerged from the crisis was battered and changed, but it was still recognizable as the heir of Augustus and Trajan. It would fall to Diocletian to build something new from what remained, to create structures of governance and defense that could prevent such a crisis from recurring. His solutions would shape the empire for centuries to come. Diocletian was born around 244 or 245 AD near Salona in Dalmatia, along the Adriatic coast. His origins were humble, perhaps the son of a freedman or of peasant farmers, a man with no family connections to ease his rise. He had joined the army as a common soldier and had worked his way up through ability and determination, serving under emperors from Gallienus to Carus and learning the arts of war and governance in the hard school of frontier service. He was shrewd, calculating, and possessed of a vision for how the empire might be reorganized to prevent the chaos that had nearly destroyed it. Where previous emperors had merely reacted to crises as they arose, Diocletian would attempt something far more ambitious, a comprehensive restructuring of how Rome was governed and defended. Diocletian proclaimed emperor by his troops in 284 AD, consolidated his position through 285, and then embarked on reforms that would define the later Roman Empire. Recognizing that the empire was simply too large for one man to govern effectively, particularly given the military threats on multiple frontiers, he divided power through a system that historians call the Tetrarchy, the rule of four. He appointed a trusted comrade, Maximian, as co-emperor with the title Augustus, assigning him responsibility for the Western Empire while Diocletian himself focused on the East. Later, each Augustus appointed a junior colleague called a Caesar, creating a college of 4 rulers who could respond to threats across the vast expanse of Roman territory. This system of shared rule required more than just dividing territory. Diocletian reorganized the provinces, breaking large provinces into smaller, more manageable units and grouping them into larger administrative districts called dioceses. He separated civil and military authority, so that governors no longer commanded troops and generals no longer administered cities. He reformed taxation, creating more systematic methods of assessment and collection that could fund the enlarged armies the empire now required. He built new palaces and administrative centers in cities closer to the frontiers, recognizing that Rome itself was no longer central to imperial governance. The emperor no longer needed to be in Rome. He needed to be wherever the military situation demanded, whether that was Milan or Trier, Nicomedia or Antioch. The Tetrarchy represented a profound break with the past, even as it claimed to restore traditional order. Under this system, Diocletian served as senior Augustus in the east, while Maximian held the same rank in the west. Beneath them, Galerius served as Caesar in the east and Constantius in the west, each man responsible for a section of frontier and a portion of the empire's defense. When an Augustus retired or died, his Caesar would step up to replace him and appoint a new Caesar in turn, creating what was meant to be an orderly succession based on merit rather than blood. It was an elegant solution to the problem of succession that had plagued the empire for generations, though time would reveal its fundamental fragility. Maximian, born around 250 AD in the Balkans, was a soldier much like Diocletian himself, a man who had risen through the ranks and proven his worth in countless campaigns along the frozen Rhine and the sun-scorched deserts of the east. He was rougher than Diocletian, more comfortable with the simple life of the camps than with the ceremonial demands of court, but he was loyal and effective. Diocletian elevated him first to Caesar and then to Augustus, trusting him to manage the troubled western provinces, while Diocletian himself dealt with Persian threats and Egyptian revolts that demanded his personal attention. Together they made an effective partnership, each respecting the other's sphere of authority, each recognizing that the empire's survival depended on cooperation rather than the rivalry that had destroyed so many of their predecessors. It was a relationship built on military brotherhood and mutual necessity, the bond of men who had faced death together and understood what was at stake. The tetrarchic system demanded new expressions of imperial power, new ways of representing authority to subjects who might never see their rulers in person. Diocletian understood that the near-constant turnover of emperors during the crisis had eroded respect for the office itself. Men had watched emperor after emperor rise and fall, had seen the purple become almost commonplace, something seized by any ambitious general with loyal troops. To restore the majesty of imperial power, Diocletian surrounded himself with elaborate ceremonial that set the emperor apart from ordinary mortals. He adopted the trappings of an oriental monarch, wearing robes of purple silk sewn with gold thread, crowning himself with a diadem studded with gems, requiring visitors to prostrate themselves before approaching his presence. The emperor was no longer merely first among citizens. He was dominus, lord and master, elevated above humanity itself. This transformation of imperial ceremony served practical purposes beyond mere vanity or personal taste. By making the emperor seem almost divine, a figure set apart from ordinary humanity by the very trappings of his office, Diocletian hoped to make assassination seem not merely criminal but sacrilegious. Who would dare to strike down a living god, to raise a hand against one who stood so clearly apart from mortal men and their petty concerns? The elaborate rituals also helped to manage the transition between rulers, creating a sense of continuity that transcended individual emperors and their particular personalities. It was the office that mattered, the sacred position, not the particular man who happened to occupy it at any given moment. Subjects could transfer their loyalty from one Augustus to another without feeling that anything fundamental had changed, because the ceremonial framework remained constant and unchanging, a fixed point in a turbulent world. Diocletian's religious policies would cast a long shadow over his reign and his legacy. For most of his rule, he showed little interest in persecuting Christians, who by this time had grown numerous throughout the empire, particularly in the eastern provinces. They served in his army, worked in his administration, and lived peacefully alongside their pagan neighbors in most communities. But in 303 AD, Influenced perhaps by Galerius or by concerns about military loyalty, Diocletian initiated what would become known as the Great Persecution, the most severe and systematic attempt to suppress Christianity in Roman history. Churches were destroyed, scriptures were burned, clergy were arrested, and ordinary Christians were compelled to sacrifice to the traditional gods or face imprisonment, torture, and death. The persecution continued with varying intensity for nearly a decade, claiming thousands of martyrs whose stories would be treasured by later generations of believers and told around hearths and in churches for centuries to come. In some provinces, enforcement was zealous and bloody, with officials competing to demonstrate their loyalty to the old gods and their zeal for the emperor's commands. In others, officials looked the other way or accepted minimal compliance, satisfied with token gestures that allowed both sides to preserve their dignity and their lives. Constantius, ruling in the far west where Christian communities were smaller but still present, applied the edicts with notable reluctance, destroying churches but largely sparing lives, a moderation that Christians would remember with gratitude. The persecution ultimately failed in its goal of eliminating Christianity, instead strengthening the resolve of believers and creating a generation of martyrs whose example inspired others to hold fast to their faith. It would be left to later emperors to recognize that Christianity could not be destroyed, only accommodated and perhaps even embraced. Galerius, who served as Caesar under Diocletian in the east and later succeeded to Augustus, was born around 250 AD in the Balkans, near the region that had produced so many of the soldier emperors of the 3rd century. His origins were humble, his mother reportedly a peasant woman who worshipped the old mountain gods of her ancestors, and he had risen through the army by talent and determination. He was a capable military commander, rough-hewn and direct in his manner, more comfortable in the camp than in the palace, more at ease with soldiers than with courtiers. His campaigns against the Persians proved largely successful after initial setbacks, and he extended Roman influence in the east while Diocletian focused on administration and reform. He was also, according to Christian sources at least, the driving force behind the Great Persecution, though how much this portrayal reflects historical reality and how much it reflects later Christian hostility remains debated by scholars who study this complex period. Constantius Chlorus, whose epithet means the pale one, and may have referred to his complexion or perhaps to some aspect of his manner that contemporaries found distinctive, served as Caesar in the west under Maximian, responsible for Britain and Gaul and the long frontier along the Rhine where Germanic tribes pressed constantly against Roman defenses. He was born around 250 AD, likely in the Balkans like his colleagues, though some sources place his origins in Dardania, a region that had produced more than its share of capable soldiers. His rise through the military ranks had been steady and distinguished, marked by competence rather than brilliance, and he had proven himself an able administrator as well as a capable general. Unlike his Eastern colleagues, Constantius showed little enthusiasm for persecuting Christians, preferring to focus on the practical matters of defense and governance that the Western provinces demanded and that consumed most of his attention. Constantius faced significant challenges in his portion of the empire, challenges that would have tested any ruler. Britain had broken away under a usurper named Carus, who had established an independent state and successfully resisted initial attempts at reconquest, building a fleet that controlled the waters between Britain and the continent. It took years of patient preparation before Constantius could mount an effective campaign, finally recovering Britain in 296 AD and restoring it to the empire. The campaign showcased his methodical approach to warfare, his willingness to take time and prepare thoroughly rather than rushing into poorly planned operations that might end in disaster. He understood that in the 4th century, the empire could not afford to waste armies on failed ventures. The family connections within the tetrarchy were meant to cement the bonds between rulers and ensure smooth succession. Galerius married Diocletian's daughter Valeria, while Constantius divorced his first wife Helena to marry Theodora, Maximian's stepdaughter. These dynastic marriages created webs of obligation and affection that were supposed to prevent the kind of civil wars that had torn the empire apart in the previous century. Children born of these unions would have claims to power, but would also be bound by family loyalty to work with rather than against their relatives. It was an elegant theory, though practice would prove rather different. Helena, the woman Constantius set aside for political reasons, would later become one of the most famous figures of the age. She was of humble origin, perhaps the daughter of an innkeeper, and had given Constantius a son named Constantine before their separation. Though put aside, she was not forgotten. Her son would remember her, and when he came to power, he would elevate her to the highest honors, making her Augusta and showering her with resources that she devoted to Christian piety. Churches rose at her command throughout the Holy Land, built over sites associated with Christ's life and death. Legend would credit her with discovering the true cross itself, bringing this most sacred of relics to light after centuries of concealment. In 305 AD, something unprecedented occurred in Roman history, an event that astonished contemporaries and continues to puzzle historians today. Diocletian voluntarily abdicated, surrendering power and retiring to a magnificent palace he had built at Split on the Dalmatian coast, overlooking the blue waters of the Adriatic. He was the first emperor ever to willingly give up the throne, to set aside the purple and return to private life, and he compelled his reluctant colleague Maximian to do the same, though Maximian went with far less grace and would later attempt to return to power. Both Augusti stepped aside simultaneously, allowing their Caesars to rise to the senior position in an orderly transition of authority. Galerius became Augustus in the east, Constantius in the west, and new Caesars were appointed to support them. It was meant to demonstrate that the tetrarchic system worked, that succession could be peaceful and orderly, that the terrible civil wars of the past need never recur if only men followed the rules that Diocletian had established. The system Diocletian had created was meant to outlast any individual ruler, to perpetuate itself through regular cycles of retirement and promotion. But he had underestimated the power of blood and the ambitions of those who had been passed over. When Constantius died in 306 AD at York in Britain, his troops did not wait for the orderly tetrarchic succession to take its course. Instead, they acclaimed his son Constantine as Augustus, following the old pattern of soldiers raising their general to the purple. The system Diocletian had so carefully constructed began to unravel almost immediately, victim of the very forces it had been designed to contain. Constantine, born around 272 AD in Nisus in the Balkans, had spent much of his youth at Diocletian's court in the east, serving as a hostage of sorts to guarantee his father's loyalty. It was a common practice among the tetrarchs, keeping the sons of colleagues close at hand where they could be watched and controlled, where their fates would depend on their father's continued obedience to the system. The young Constantine received an excellent education in both military arts and the refined culture of the Eastern court, learning how power worked from the inside, observing the ceremonies and councils that shaped imperial policy. He saw how Diocletian wielded authority, how the elaborate ceremonial of the court enhanced rather than diminished real power, and how the careful balance of the tetrarchy was maintained through constant attention and occasional coercion. He served in Diocletian's campaigns along the Danube and in the east, proving himself a capable soldier and earning the respect of veteran officers who recognized talent when they saw it. He watched the machinery of the tetrarchy in operation, learning lessons he would later apply in very different ways when circumstances placed him in positions his father's colleagues had never intended. When the succession of 305 AD occurred, Constantine found himself in a precarious position. He was not included in the new arrangements, passed over in favor of Severus and Maximinus Daia, men with stronger connections to Galerius but lesser claims of blood. Constantine was too dangerous to ignore but too valuable to eliminate openly, and so he remained at Galerius's court, a virtual prisoner whose future remained uncertain. He understood that his life hung by a thread, that any perceived disloyalty or any change in political circumstances could result in his quiet elimination. The tension must have been unbearable for a young man of ability and ambition who knew his father ruled in the West, but could do nothing to help him. According to later accounts that may blend fact with legend, Constantine escaped from Galerius's court and fled westward to join his father, traveling with such speed that he hamstrung the post horses at each station to prevent pursuit. Whether this dramatic tale is true or embellished, Constantine did make his way to Constantius, reaching him in Britain where the elder man was campaigning against the Picts beyond Hadrian's Wall. Father and son were reunited after years of separation, and Constantine took his place in his father's army, learning the ways of frontier warfare in the misty hills of northern Britain. It was a far cry from the sophisticated courts of the East, but it was also freedom, and it placed Constantine close to power when the moment came. Constantius died at York on the 25th of July in 306 AD, worn out by illness and the demands of the British campaign. The circumstances of his death would prove fateful for the empire. His troops, assembled in that distant northern city, acclaimed Constantine as Augustus immediately upon his father's death, following the old pattern of military acclamation that the Tetrarchy was supposed to have replaced. The soldiers knew Constantine had served with him and saw in him a continuation of his father's rule. They had no interest in the orderly succession planned in distant Nicomedia, no loyalty to emperors they had never met. Their emperor was here before them, and they raised him on their shields in the ancient manner. Galerius, now senior Augustus after Diocletian's retirement and the acknowledged architect of the Tetrarchic system's current form, was furious at this breach of the carefully planned succession that he had helped design. The whole point of the Tetrarchy was to prevent exactly this kind of military coup, this reversion to the chaotic pattern that had nearly destroyed the empire in the previous century. But Galerius was also pragmatic enough to recognize the reality of the situation confronting him. He could not easily unseat Constantine from his position in the distant West without a major military campaign that would weaken the empire as a whole and leave other frontiers vulnerable to barbarian attack. A civil war launched against Constantine would consume resources desperately needed elsewhere, and might well end in defeat if Constantine's troops proved as loyal as their initial acclamation suggested. Instead, Galerius offered a compromise that saved face while acknowledging facts on the ground, a diplomatic solution that demonstrated both his frustration and his realism. Constantine would be recognized, but only as Caesar, not as Augustus. The senior rank in the West would go to Severus, Galerius's own man, who would theoretically outrank Constantine and maintain the proper tetrarchic hierarchy. It was a solution that satisfied no one fully but avoided immediate civil war, postponing rather than resolving the underlying tensions. But the compromise could not hold, for it failed to account for other ambitious claimants. In Rome itself, the Praetorian Guard and the Roman populace chafed under tetrarchic rule that had marginalized their city and threatened their privileges. In October of 306 AD, they acclaimed Maxentius, son of the retired Emperor Maximian, as their ruler. Maxentius was not part of the tetrarchic system, held no recognized position, but he had the support of Rome and Italy, and his father soon came out of retirement to back his son's claim. The orderly succession that Diocletian had designed was dissolving into chaos, with multiple claimants competing for power across the empire. Severus, the Western Augustus appointed by Galerius to maintain the tetrarchic order, marched against Rome to suppress Maxentius's rebellion, confident that his imperial authority would make short work of an upstart who held no legitimate position. But his campaign ended in disaster that revealed how completely the tetrarchic system had failed to command the loyalty it required. His troops deserted to Maxentius in droves, won over by the name of Maximian and by bribes distributed from the ancient treasuries of Rome. The old loyalties to dynasty and city proved stronger than the new loyalties to an impersonal system of succession. Severus himself was captured and eventually killed, eliminating one of Galerius's carefully chosen successors. Galerius himself then led an army into Italy, reaching the walls of Rome itself, but he too found his troops unreliable and was forced to retreat without achieving his objective. The city that had once ruled the world had successfully defied the tetrarchic emperors, and the system Diocletian had built continued to crumble. These years of civil war tested all the claimants and eliminated those too weak to survive the struggle. Maximian, having come out of retirement to support his son, soon quarreled with Maxentius and was forced into exile. He fled to Constantine's court in Gaul, where he was received with honor despite the complicated politics his presence created. Constantine even married Maximian's daughter Fausta, cementing an alliance that brought legitimacy and connections, though Fausta's presence at court would later bring tragedy as well as advantage. The marriage united two of the major dynasties competing for power, though it could not ultimately reconcile their competing ambitions. Maximian could not accept a subordinate role, even in comfortable exile. In 310 AD, while Constantine was away on campaign, the old emperor attempted to seize power for himself, proclaiming himself Augustus once again and trying to win over Constantine's troops. The attempt failed utterly. Constantine returned quickly, cornered Maximian at Marseilles, and forced him to surrender. Shortly afterward, Maximian was dead, by suicide according to Constantine's official version, though few believed that a man of Maximian's tenacious ambition had willingly taken his own life. However he died, his death removed one more player from the complex game of imperial politics. Galerius had watched the Western Empire dissolve into civil war from his base in the east, unable to impose order despite his seniority as the system's guardian. His health began to fail around 310 AD, the robust soldier's body betraying him at last, and he died in 311 AD of what ancient sources describe as a terrible wasting disease that may have been bowel cancer or some similar malignancy. The Christian writer Lactantius described his death in lurid detail, presenting it as divine punishment for his role in the Great Persecution, his flesh rotting away while he still lived. Before his death, Galerius issued an edict of toleration that ended the Great Persecution and allowed Christians to worship freely again, a remarkable reversal that some attributed to a deathbed conversion and others to simple pragmatism born of exhaustion. Whatever his motivation, the edict marked a turning point in imperial religious policy, an acknowledgement that nearly a decade of persecution had failed to suppress the new faith and that the time had come for a different approach. The empire needed unity, and religious conflict had brought only division and weakness. Galerius's death left four major claimants for power: Constantine in the west, Maxentius in Italy, Licinius in the Balkans, and Maximinus Thrax in the east. Each controlled significant territories and armies, each claimed imperial legitimacy, and each knew that the empire could not indefinitely sustain four rulers of equal ambition. The stage was set for a final reckoning that would determine who would unite the Roman world under a single rule. Constantine, patient and calculating, began preparing for the campaign that would define his reign and transform the empire forever. In 312 AD, Constantine made his move against Maxentius. It was a gamble, for Maxentius held Italy and Africa with substantial forces, and many of Constantine's own advisors counseled caution. But Constantine had learned that hesitation in Roman politics usually proved fatal, that waiting allowed rivals to grow stronger while one's own position weakened. He crossed the Alps with an army that ancient sources describe as smaller than his opponents, trusting in the quality of his veteran troops and in his own ability to outmaneuver his enemies. The campaign that followed would become one of the most consequential in Roman history, though its participants could not have known how completely it would transform the world. As Constantine marched south through Italy, he won a series of engagements that scattered Maxentius's forces and opened the road to Rome. The decisive moment came at the Milvian Bridge on the Tiber, just north of Rome itself, where Maxentius chose to make his stand. Before the battle, according to accounts that Constantine himself promoted in later years, the emperor received a sign from heaven. Some versions say he saw a cross of light in the sky with the words, "In this sign conquer." Others describe a dream in which he was commanded to mark his soldiers' shields with the Christian symbol. Whatever actually occurred, Constantine emerged from the experience convinced that the Christian God had promised him victory, and he ordered his troops to carry the sacred monogram into battle. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge ended with Maxentius's death and Constantine's triumph, a victory that would reshape the course of Western civilization. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber as his forces fled, pushed into the swollen river by the crush of panicking soldiers whose bridge of boats collapsed under their desperate weight. His body was recovered later, dragged from the muddy waters that had claimed so many of his men, and his head was paraded through the streets of Rome on a pike as proof that the old order had truly fallen. Constantine entered the city as a liberator, though the Romans had not particularly sought liberation and had supported Maxentius with considerable enthusiasm for the past 6 years. He accepted the acclamation of the Senate with appropriate humility, participated in the traditional ceremonies of victory that Roman generals had performed for centuries, but notably omitted the customary sacrifice to Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill that had always concluded such triumphs. It was a subtle signal that something fundamental had changed, that the emperor who now ruled the West followed a different god than those who had come before him. The following year, in 313 AD, Constantine met with Licinius at Milan, and together they issued what historians call the Edict of Milan, though it was technically more of an agreement between the two surviving senior emperors than a formal edict. This remarkable document granted complete religious freedom throughout the empire, ending all persecution and allowing Christians to worship openly without fear of punishment or discrimination. Properties confiscated during the persecution were to be returned to their rightful owners, and Christians were to enjoy the same rights as followers of any other religion, free to build churches, hold assemblies, and practice their faith as they saw fit. It was a revolutionary document, sweeping away centuries of intermittent persecution in which thousands had suffered and died for their beliefs, and establishing a principle of religious tolerance that, whatever its limitations in practice, marked an entirely new direction for imperial policy. The empire that had tried so hard to destroy Christianity now officially accepted it as a legitimate faith entitled to imperial protection. Constantine spent the following years consolidating his power and eliminating remaining rivals. Maximinus Daia, who had ruled in the East and briefly continued the persecution of Christians, was defeated by Licinius in 313 AD and died shortly afterward. This left Constantine and Licinius as co-emperors, but their alliance was always uneasy, marked by mutual suspicion and occasional open conflict. They fought wars in 316 and 324 AD, the second of which ended with Licinius's complete defeat. Constantine, who had started as one of several competing claimants, now ruled the entire Roman Empire alone, the first sole emperor in nearly 40 years. Having reunited the empire under his rule, Constantine turned to building projects that would reshape the Roman world physically as well as politically, leaving monuments that would endure for centuries after his death. His most ambitious undertaking was the transformation of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium into a new capital that bore his name, a city that would become one of the great centers of civilization. Constantinople, the city of Constantine, rose on the European shore of the Bosphorus, commanding the narrow waterway that linked the Black Sea to the Mediterranean and controlled some of the most important trade routes in the ancient world. Its location was strategically perfect, defensible by land and sea against any conceivable enemy, positioned to respond to threats from both the Danube frontier in the north and the Persian border in the east. Work began in 324 AD and continued for years with tens of thousands of laborers. The city officially dedicated in 330 AD amid celebrations and ceremonies that combined Roman tradition with the new Christian faith that Constantine had embraced. The new capital was designed as a Christian city from its inception, something Rome with its pagan temples and ancient traditions could never fully become. Constantine adorned it with churches rather than temples, filled it with Christian relics collected from across the empire, and made clear that this city represented a new era in Roman history. The old Senate and aristocracy might cling to their ancestral ways in Rome, but the future lay in the East, in this new foundation that combined Roman tradition with Christian faith. Constantinople would remain the capital of the Eastern Empire for over 1,000 years, outlasting Rome itself by centuries. Constantine's religious policies went far beyond mere toleration of Christianity, extending into active promotion and patronage that transformed the Church from a persecuted sect into a pillar of the imperial establishment. He showered the Church with favors of every kind, granting clergy exemption from the onerous civic duties that burdened other citizens, providing generous funds from imperial treasuries for the construction of magnificent churches throughout the empire, and inserting himself into theological disputes as if his imperial authority extended to matters of doctrine and belief. When controversy erupted over the teachings of Arius, an Alexandrian priest who argued that Christ was created by God the Father rather than eternal with him, Constantine summoned bishops from across the empire to a council at Nicaea in 325 AD. There, under imperial supervision and with imperial pressure applied when necessary, the assembled bishops hammered out a creed that condemned Arianism and established the orthodox position that would shape Christianity for millennia to come. The emperor who had once commanded legions now presided over debates about the nature of the Trinity, a remarkable transformation that illustrated how completely the Roman world was changing. Constantine's family life was considerably more troubled than his public achievements might suggest, marked by tragedy and violence that darkened his later years. He had married twice, first to Minervina, who bore him his eldest son Crispus, a young man of ability and promise, and then to Fausta, daughter of Maximian, who gave him 3 more sons and 2 daughters. In 326 AD, scandal engulfed the imperial household, a scandal whose details remain maddeningly obscure. Constantine ordered the execution of Crispus, his capable and popular eldest son, who had won victories for him in battle and seemed destined to continue his legacy, followed shortly by the death of Fausta herself, allegedly suffocated in an overheated bath in circumstances that suggested either accident or deliberate murder. The reasons for these deaths were never officially explained and became the subject of endless speculation among contemporaries and historians alike. Some sources suggest that Fausta accused Crispus of attempting to seduce her, then was killed when Constantine discovered the accusation was false, a tragic echo of the myth of Hippolytus and Phaedra that Greek tragedians had dramatized centuries before. Whatever the truth, Constantine had eliminated both his most promising heir and the mother of his remaining sons, a domestic catastrophe that cast a shadow over the final decade of his reign. Constantine died on the 22nd of May in 337 AD, at the age of approximately 65, after a reign that had lasted over 3 decades and transformed every aspect of Roman life. He had postponed his baptism until he lay on his deathbed, a common practice in an age when baptism was believed to wash away all sins, and many wished to approach it with as clean a slate as possible after lives filled with the compromises that power demanded. He was buried in Constantinople, in the Church of the Holy Apostles that he had built for this very purpose, his sarcophagus surrounded by monuments to the 12 apostles, as if he were in some sense their equal or their successor. The 13th apostle who had brought the faith of Christ to the empire of the Caesars. He had transformed the Roman world more completely than any emperor since Augustus himself, linking the fate of the empire to the Christian faith in ways that would prove unbreakable even as the centuries passed, and the world continued to change around the foundations he had laid. Constantine left the empire to his 3 surviving sons, a division that seemed reasonable at the time but would soon lead to bloodshed and civil war. Constantine II, the eldest at around 21 years old, received Gaul, Britain, and Spain. Constans, just 17, was assigned Italy, Africa, and Illyricum. Constantius II, 20 years old, inherited the wealthy and strategically vital eastern provinces. It was a partition that reflected both geography and the need to maintain strong military commands on all frontiers, but it also ensured that 3 ambitious young men would spend their reigns watching each other warily, each wondering when the others might strike. Before the brothers could even establish themselves securely in their territories, a massacre swept through the extended imperial family, a bloodbath that shocked contemporaries and that historians still debate today. Within months of Constantine's death, nearly all of his brothers and nephews were killed, their deaths attributed to soldiers acting on their own initiative, but almost certainly carried out with the knowledge and approval of at least some of the new emperors. The purge eliminated potential rivals and consolidated power in the hands of Constantine's direct heirs, ensuring that no uncle or cousin could challenge their authority or claim a share of their father's legacy. But it also demonstrated the ruthlessness that would characterize Constantinian politics, the willingness to shed family blood in pursuit of security that marked these Christian emperors as surely as it had marked their pagan predecessors. Only 2 young boys survived the slaughter, Gallus and Julian, sons of Constantine's half-brother Julius Constantius. They were spared perhaps because of their youth, perhaps because they seemed too insignificant to worry about, a judgment that would prove remarkably mistaken in the years to come. Constantine II, the eldest brother, was ambitious and dissatisfied with his share of the empire. He had hoped to inherit more, perhaps to exercise some sort of guardianship over his younger brothers, and his frustration grew as they asserted their independence. In 340 AD, just 3 years after their father's death, Constantine II invaded Italy, claiming that Constans had been unfair in dividing their territories. The campaign was poorly planned and worse executed. Constantine II died in battle near Aquileia, ambushed and killed by his brother's forces, his body left in the river also while his army scattered and surrendered. Constans absorbed his brother's territories, becoming ruler of the entire Western Empire at just 20 years old. Constans ruled the West for a decade, from 340 to 350 AD, a reign that ancient sources describe in unflattering terms that may reflect genuine failings, or may simply reflect the bias of writers who knew how his reign ended. He was said to be arrogant and cruel, alienating the senatorial aristocracy whose support every emperor needed, and the military commanders upon whom his power ultimately depended. He showed favor to barbarian bodyguards over Roman soldiers, surrounding himself with Germanic warriors who owed loyalty to him personally rather than to Roman tradition, a practice that bred resentment among troops who expected preferential treatment from an emperor they served. His sexual preferences, hinted at darkly in the sources with the kind of scandalized language that ancient writers reserved for behaviors they considered shameful, apparently offended contemporaries who expected their emperors to maintain at least a pretense of traditional morality and proper Roman dignity. Whatever his personal failings, his political failures proved fatal when a general named Maxentius launched a rebellion in Gaul that would end Constance's reign and his life. Maxentius was a soldier of barbarian origin who had risen high in the imperial service, a pattern that had become increasingly common as Rome relied more heavily on troops drawn from beyond its borders. In January of 350 AD, he was proclaimed emperor by his troops at Augustodunum, and his rebellion spread rapidly through Gaul and into other western provinces. Constans fled when he learned of the usurpation, but his support evaporated as soldiers and officials abandoned him for the new regime. He was caught and killed in the foothills of the Pyrenees, murdered by agents of Maxentius while trying to escape to Spain. He was just 27 years old, having ruled for a decade without ever winning the loyalty that might have saved him. Constantius II, now the only surviving son of Constantine the Great, spent his early reign focused on the Persian frontier, where the Sasanian Empire under Shapur II posed a constant threat. Warfare with Persia was almost continuous throughout his reign, with sieges and battles and raids that consumed enormous resources without ever achieving a decisive resolution. The fortress city of Nisibis withstood 3 major Persian sieges during these years, its walls holding firm against everything Shapur could throw against them. Constantius himself proved a capable if not brilliant commander, maintaining the frontier and preserving Roman positions despite the pressure he faced from the east. When news reached Constantius of his brother's death and Maxentius's usurpation, he faced a terrible choice. The Persian War demanded his attention, but leaving the West in the hands of a usurper was unthinkable. He needed a reliable subordinate who could manage the eastern frontier while he dealt with the crisis in the West. But the massacre of 337 had eliminated almost all of his relatives. Only his young cousins Gallus and Julian remained, the boys who had been spared in that bloody purge and who had grown up in a kind of comfortable exile, educated but kept far from power. Constantius elevated Gallus to the rank of Caesar in 351 AD, giving him responsibility for the eastern provinces while Constantius himself marched west to confront Maxentius. Gallus proved a disastrous choice. He was suspicious, violent, and perhaps mentally unstable, his years of isolation and uncertainty having left scars that power only worsened. He executed officials on the slightest suspicion, terrorized the cities under his control, and alienated virtually everyone who had to deal with him. By 354 AD, Constantius had dealt with Maxentius and could no longer ignore the disaster unfolding in the east. He summoned Gallus to explain himself, and Gallus was arrested, tried, and executed before he ever reached his cousin's presence. The war against Maxentius was brutal and costly, a civil war that drained Roman strength at a time when external threats demanded every available soldier. The decisive battle came at Mursa in Pannonia in 351 AD, one of the bloodiest engagements in Roman history and a catastrophe for the empire regardless of which side emerged victorious. Ancient sources claim that over 50,000 soldiers died on that single day, Romans killing Romans in a slaughter that weakened the empire's military capacity for a generation. The best troops of both East and West cut each other down on that bloody field, veterans who could never be replaced falling by the thousands as the battle raged from dawn until darkness finally ended the killing. Constantius won the battle, but at a terrible cost that haunted the empire for decades, and Maxentius retreated westward to continue resistance with his shattered forces. It took 2 more years of campaigning before the usurper was finally cornered and defeated, 2 more years of bleeding an empire that could ill afford the loss. Maxentius committed suicide in 353 AD, falling on his sword rather than face capture, and the humiliating death that awaited defeated usurpers, and his supporters were hunted down and executed in a purge that spread fear throughout the western provinces. With Maxentius dead and Gallus executed, Constantius found himself sole ruler of the Roman Empire, but desperately short of trustworthy relatives who could share the burdens of governance. Julian, Gallus's younger brother, was the only member of the imperial family still alive. Constantius had kept him in obscurity, allowing him to pursue philosophical studies in Athens and elsewhere while keeping him far from military command. In 355 AD, faced with continuing threats in Gaul where Germanic tribes were raiding almost at will, Constantius reluctantly elevated Julian to Caesar and sent him west. It was a desperate gamble, entrusting power to a young man he barely knew and had every reason to distrust. Julian proved surprisingly capable, exceeding every expectation that Constantius might have had for this untried young philosopher. Despite having no military experience beyond what he could learn from books, poring over ancient accounts of Alexander's campaigns and Caesar's wars in the quiet of his study, he won victories against the Alemanni and other Germanic peoples, restoring Roman authority in Gaul and winning the fierce loyalty of his soldiers. His most famous victory came at Strasbourg in 357 AD, where he defeated a much larger Germanic force in a battle that ancient sources describe in vivid detail. Julian led from the front, risking his life alongside his men, and when the battle was won he captured the Germanic king himself, presenting the prisoner as proof that Rome's power had returned to the Rhine frontier. The soldiers who served under him came to love him for his willingness to share their hardships, sleeping on the ground when they did, eating the same simple rations, and showing personal courage in battle that inspired those around him. His attention to their welfare won hearts that gold and promises could not have purchased. Julian the scholar was becoming Julian the general, and his growing reputation made his cousin Constantius increasingly uneasy about what he had unleashed. The tension between Constantius and Julian built slowly, but inexorably through the late 350s. Constantius watched with growing alarm as his young Caesar accumulated victories, and, more dangerously, the devotion of the Western armies. Julian, for his part, chafed under restrictions imposed from Constantinople, orders that seemed designed to limit his authority and prevent him from building the power base that success naturally created. The empire was too large and too threatened for such distrust between its rulers, but neither man could overcome the suspicions bred by years of family bloodshed. The break came in 360 AD, when Constantius demanded that Julian send a large portion of his best troops east to reinforce the Persian War. Julian's soldiers refused the order, proclaiming that they would not leave Gaul for distant eastern campaigns. Whether Julian instigated their refusal or merely yielded to it, the result was the same. His troops acclaimed him Augustus, and civil war became inevitable. Julian, the philosopher who had spent his youth among books and teachers, now found himself leading his army eastward against his cousin, the last surviving member of the family that had once massacred his own. The civil war that seemed certain to devastate the empire never actually occurred. As Julian marched east and Constantius marched west, gathering their forces for what would have been a catastrophic confrontation, Constantius fell ill. He died on the 3rd of November in 361 AD at Mopsuestia in Cilicia, naming Julian as his successor in his final moments. Whether this deathbed recognition was genuine or invented by Julian's partisans, it gave Julian's accession a veneer of legitimacy that helped smooth the transition. Julian entered Constantinople as sole emperor of the Roman world, the last surviving member of the Constantinian dynasty. What Julian did next stunned the empire and left contemporaries struggling to make sense of so dramatic a transformation. He had been raised as a Christian, educated by Christian tutors who had shaped his formal education, and had given every appearance of conformity to the faith that his uncle Constantine had embraced and that his cousin Constantius had defended with increasing rigor against doctrinal deviation. But in private, during those quiet years of study far from power, Julian had turned away from Christianity. drawn instead to the old gods of Greece and Rome and to the Neoplatonic philosophical traditions that he had studied so avidly and that seemed to him to offer deeper truths than the faith of the Galileans. As emperor, he publicly revealed his paganism, announcing his intention to restore the worship of the traditional gods and reverse the Christianization that Constantine had begun nearly 50 years before. He did not persecute Christians directly, recognizing perhaps that persecution had failed before and would only strengthen what it sought to destroy, creating martyrs whose examples would inspire generations. Instead, he withdrew imperial favor with calculated precision, removing the privileges that had been granted to the Church, forbidding Christians from teaching classical literature that he claimed they did not believe in, and encouraging the restoration of pagan temples and priesthoods that had fallen into neglect. Julian's attempt to revive paganism was sincere, but probably doomed from the start. Christianity had sunk deep roots in the 4 decades since Constantine's conversion, winning converts at every level of society and building institutional structures that could weather temporary setbacks. The old paganism that Julian tried to restore had never possessed the organizational coherence of Christianity, consisting instead of countless local cults and traditions that had no unified doctrine or hierarchy. Julian tried to reform paganism on the Christian model, creating a structured priesthood with charitable obligations and moral standards, but he was trying to create in months what Christianity had built over centuries. Julian's reign was brief, consumed largely by his grand ambition to defeat Persia once and for all, to achieve what so many Roman emperors had attempted and so few had accomplished. In 363 AD, he led a massive army eastward in an invasion meant to surpass the achievements of Alexander himself, an army of perhaps 65,000 men that represented the greatest concentration of Roman military power in generations. The campaign began brilliantly, with Julian's forces advancing deep into Persian territory through the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, brushing aside opposition and reaching the walls of the Persian capital Ctesiphon after victories that seemed to herald a new age of Roman dominance in the east. But there at Ctesiphon Julian hesitated, uncertain whether to besiege the great city with its formidable defenses or to seek a decisive battle with the Persian field army that remained undefeated somewhere in the interior. The decision to withdraw without capturing Ctesiphon proved fatal to the campaign and to Julian himself. As the Roman army retreated through hostile territory, burning the fleet they had used to travel down the rivers and now forced to march through scorching lands stripped of supplies by Persian scorched earth tactics. They were harassed constantly by Persian cavalry that struck and retreated before the legions could respond. Julian was struck by a spear during one such skirmish, the weapon piercing deep into his side, and he died from his wounds on the 26th of June, far from the philosophical pursuits he loved. Ancient sources report that Julian's last words were a cry of despair, a final acknowledgement of the battle he had lost. "You have won, Galilean," referring to Christ by the name that pagans used for the teacher from Galilee whose followers had conquered the Roman world. Whether he actually spoke these words as he lay dying in his tent, the physicians unable to save him from the wound that drained his life, or whether they were invented by Christian writers who wished to dramatize their victory over the emperor who had tried to destroy their faith, they captured a truth that Julian himself must have recognized in those final hours. His whole reign had been a gamble against history, an attempt to restore what was already passing away, and that gamble had failed. The brief pagan revival died with him there in the Persian sands. His successor Jovian, a Christian officer chosen hastily by the army to lead them safely home from the disaster unfolding around them in Persian territory, immediately restored Christianity to its privileged position, renouncing the concessions that Julian had extracted from the Church. And no subsequent emperor would ever attempt what Julian had tried. The apostate's dream perished with him, and the empire continued on its Christian path. Julian the Apostate, as Christians called him in the centuries after his death, using that name as both description and condemnation, remains one of the most fascinating figures of late antiquity, a man whose brief reign has inspired endless debate and interpretation. He was a philosopher-king in the tradition of Marcus Aurelius, a genuine intellectual who preferred books to banquets and discourse to display, who could spend hours discussing Plato or Homer with the learned men he gathered around him. He wrote extensively, leaving behind letters, orations, and satirical works that reveal a complex and cultivated mind, a man who thought deeply about the nature of the gods, the purpose of government, and the meaning of the philosophical life. He was also a capable general who won real victories against genuine threats, leading from the front with a courage that inspired his soldiers even as it exposed him to the dangers that ultimately claimed his life. But he was also a dreamer who imagined that history could be reversed, that the old gods could reclaim their altars, and the world could return to what it had been before Constantine changed everything. In this, he was wrong, profoundly and completely wrong. The future belonged to the faith he had rejected, and his attempt to turn back the tide of religious change served only to demonstrate how irreversible that change had become. With Julian's death, the dynasty of Constantine came to an end. For emperors in 26 years, constant civil war and family bloodshed, religious controversy and persecution, yet also the transformation of the empire in ways that would endure for centuries. Constantinople would remain the capital of the Eastern Empire until 1453, over 1,000 years after Constantine laid its foundations. The Christianity that Constantine embraced would shape European civilization in ways beyond counting. The administrative reforms begun by Diocletian and continued by Constantine would define how Rome governed itself until the empire's final dissolution. And so we come to the end of this portion of our journey through Roman history. We have traveled from the crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire nearly perished, through the reforms of Diocletian and the transformation under Constantine, to the brief and brilliant reign of Julian and the establishment of Christianity as the empire's permanent faith. Emperors have risen and fallen, cities have been built and destroyed, armies have marched across continents, and yet the essential story remains one of human beings grappling with power and faith, with ambition and mortality. Rest now, and let these names and dates settle into memory like leaves falling softly onto still water. The emperors sleep in their tombs, their struggles ended, their legacies secure. Perhaps we may join them soon in peaceful slumber, carrying their stories with us into dreams.